The column came into view at mid-morning. Do-jin saw it first from the ridge path above the eastern gate, a dark seam moving through the pine-gray hills, resolving as it drew closer into soldiers, banners, the glint of lacquered armor, and at its head a single figure on horseback, whose stillness made the motion around him feel like weather. Ryugyam, court inspector, the man who had watched Iron Ridge grow from dispatches and chosen, until now, to let the dispatches pile up. There was no mistaking the column's purpose. Punitive armies did not send heralds ahead, they sent their own silhouette. Walls of iron, smoke like a second sky. Ryugyam's voice, when it reached them later, carried the particular flatness of a man who had already decided. We should have burned it when it was one madman in a forge. He was right about the smoke. The smelting sheds and the forge house and the new reverberatory furnace all breathed together now, a layered column that hung above Iron Ridge like a second ridgeline. Do-jin had stopped noticing it months ago. Standing on the wall and watching the column approach, he noticed it again and felt, briefly, something close to pride before the fear came in behind it. Ji Wolyung received the ultimatum in the warden's hall with the messenger still standing. Surrender the works, surrender the leaders, submit to court administration by dawn, or the column would reduce Iron Ridge to the rubble it had been before a foreign engineer and a desperate warden decided to make something of it. The messenger left. Ji read the document a second time, set it on the table, and looked at it the way Do-jin had seen him look at a cracked crucible, assessing whether anything inside was worth saving. Submit and be nothing, he said, or stand and maybe die. He folded the document once, precisely, and did not pick it up again. We've been nothing. We didn't care for it. By the afternoon bell he was standing on the market platform in the yard between the forge house and the new granary, and the town had gathered, not because anyone ordered it, but because word moved through Iron Ridge, the way heat moved through iron, quickly and without asking permission. Do-jin stood at the edge of the crowd and watched Ji's face. The warden was not a man who performed. That was what made him worth following. Out there, Ji said, and pointed east toward the hills the column had already crossed, is the world that threw you away. He let that sit for a moment. Around Do-jin, people were very still. He recognized faces from the first hard winter, the smelter crew, the apprentice borers, the women who had learned to pull bellows and then learned to read a gauge, refugees, most of them. People the court had decided were not worth the cost of feeding. In here is the one that took you in and taught you to make. Ji's voice did not rise. It did not need to. Stand with me. The yard was quiet for the length of a breath. Then Baek-tae-ho, who was not a man given to public sentiment, set down the tongs he was holding and walked to stand beside the warden. Cho-young followed, then Do-gwang, then the apprentices, the borers, the bellows pullers, the gauge readers, one after another, until the platform was surrounded and the quiet had become something else entirely. Do-jin stood where he was. He was already standing with them, had been for a year. The parley happened at the eastern gate at the hour before dusk. Ryugyam and two aides on one side, Ji and Do-jin on the other, with the gate's iron-faced planking between them and the smell of pine resin and forge smoke on the wind. Ryugyam was older than Do-jin had expected, not old, perhaps 50, but worn in the way that men who carry institutional power wear when the institution begins to crack beneath them. His robes were court formal, deep blue with the inspector's silver thread, and he wore them without vanity. He looked at the gate, at the smoke above the ridge, at Do-jin's hands, which were calloused and stained in the way that no amount of washing entirely fixed, and his expression was not contempt. It was something more complicated than contempt. You've replaced something sacred, he said, with grease and arithmetic any gutter child can learn. Do-jin had thought about what he would say at this moment. He had not expected to feel anything in particular when it arrived. He felt more than he expected. That's the part you can't forgive, he said. Not that it's ugly, that it's open, that a gutter child can hold it, and a lord with a dying thread can't hold it over them anymore. Ryugyam looked at him for a long moment. The aides were very still. Behind Do-jin, he could hear the faint rhythmic sound of the stamp mill. It had not stopped for the parley, because iron did not pause for politics, and because stopping it would have been a kind of concession Do-jin was not prepared to make. What he saw in Ryugem's face then was not rage, it was grief. Genuine, unperformed grief. The grief of a man who had loved a thing and was watching it become irrelevant, and had decided that if he could not save it, he would at least not outlive it quietly. Better the dark, Ryugem said softly, than a world where being born to it means nothing. He looked once more at the smoke above the ridge. If the mandate must die, it will not die alone. There was nothing to answer to that. Do-jin turned and walked back through the gate. If heaven wants Iron Ridge, he said without turning around, heaven can come and take it. We'll be ready at dawn. The gate closed behind him. The night was organized rather than frantic, and that distinction mattered more than anything else Do-jin could have said to the people working through it. The river-powered works ran full, the stamp mill, the boring mill, the new rolling frames, and the sound of it was constant and grounding, a mechanical heartbeat that told everyone within earshot that the place was still functioning, still producing, still itself. Do-jin moved between stations with Pak Tao, checking outputs, checking tolerances, checking the faces of the people doing the work. Make it true, Beck, he said at the boring mill, where two apprentices were pushing a cannon barrel through its final pass. Not just fast. He looked at the barrel's mouth, at the clean spiral of the cut, and felt the small satisfaction of a bore that would not betray the person behind it. Then he found Dogwang at the yard's edge, overseeing the rotation of the watch shifts. Guards on, shifts rotating. We arm this town without breaking one more of our own. Dogwang nodded once, already moving. Ep 18's lesson, the lesson written in a shattered mandrel and a man's broken arm, and 3 weeks of Do-jin lying awake recalculating what haste actually cost, held through the night. No one rushed past the point of care. No one skipped a check because the column was sitting 2 li away and dawn was coming. The work was fast because the people doing it were skilled, not because they were frightened into sloppiness. There was a difference, and Do-jin had spent a year making sure everyone who worked in these yards understood it in their hands, not just their heads. Chi-Wol-young had spent the same night on the walls. By the time the sky began to gray in the east, Iron Ridge had become something it had not been 12 hours earlier. The outer walls, already iron-faced along the gatehouse sections, had been extended and reinforced, the facing plates bolted to the timber framing in overlapping courses that would shed a cavalry charge and slow a mage strike long enough to matter. At the wall's 4 corners, emplaced on timber carriages that Back's crew had built to Do-jin's drawings over the preceding month, sat the cannon, true bored, every one of them, the kind of bore that would not split under pressure because the wall of the barrel was uniform and the charge had room to do its work cleanly. Ji walked the wall at the third watch and looked out at the dark hills where the column's campfires burned in a long irregular line. They're bringing magic and numbers, he said to no one in particular, though Do-jin was standing 2 paces away and Baek was just behind. We're bringing range, iron, and discipline. He looked at the cannon nearest him, ran one hand along the cascable, not checking it, just acknowledging it. Let's see whose century it is. In the works below, Cha-young and Yoon Se-rin were finishing the last of the prepared charges. Cha-young had the orphan crew, the young ones who had come to the works with nothing and learned everything, working the powder measures under lamplight, each charge weighed and wrapped and set in order. She moved between them without hurrying them, checking each measure by hand before it was sealed. Every bore true, she said, to the room as much as to anyone in it. Not one will burst on our own people. At the next bench, Yoon Se-rin was at the balance, checking the wrapped charges against the standard weight, the iron cylinder that lived in a felt-lined box and never left the metrologist's keeping. She had been at it for 2 hours. She would be at it until the last charge was sealed. Every charge to the same weight, she said, setting one aside and reaching for the next. Precision is a weapon too. Do-jin heard both of them from the doorway and did not go in. There was nothing to add. The work was being done correctly. Somewhere in the dark hills, Ryugyum sat alone. He reached inward, the gesture so habitual it had become involuntary, the way a man who has carried a key for 30 years reaches for it without thinking. The mandate stirred faintly, like an ember that has been banked too long. Not dead, not enough. We are charging their cannon with prayers we can no longer even speak. He held the thought for a moment, then let it go. It doesn't matter. Numbers then. He was not a stupid man. He knew what numbers meant. He had read the dispatches. He reached for the mandate again anyway, because some habits outlast their usefulness, and because grief does not make a man rational. The wall at the second hour before dawn was cold and very quiet. The campfires in the hills had not moved. The works below were still running. The stamp mill's rhythm, the occasional clang of the boring mill finishing a last pass, and the sound of them rose through the cold air like something alive. Do-jin stood at the parapet and looked at the pale smear of the veil above the town, that fading dome of light that had been Iron Ridge's only protection for 3 generations, and was now, by any honest measure, less reliable than the iron beneath it. Ji-woo came to stand beside him. Afraid, Smith? Do-jin considered lying. It would have been a short consideration. Terrified, he said. He looked at the works below, the forge light, the water wheel turning in the dark, the shapes of the cannon on their carriages at the wall's corners. But a year ago this was a dying husk, and we built all of it from ore and nothing. He looked at the hills. Let them come. Ji said nothing. He did not need to. Do-gwang gathered his cohort at the base of the main wall as the sky began to lighten. Not soldiers, most of them, not men and women who had trained for this since childhood. Smelter crew, boring mill hands, apprentices who had spent the last year learning to hold a gauge and read a mark and stand at a station for a full shift without drifting. People who had been in the courts accounting nothing. Do-gwang looked at them for a moment before he spoke. He had a scar across his left jaw from the accident in the 3rd month, the one that had taught everyone in the works, including Do-jin, something important about what safety actually required. He wore it without self-consciousness. "You're not the people they threw away," he said. "Not tomorrow." He looked down the line, faces he knew, hands he knew, the particular way each of them stood when they were paying attention. "Tomorrow you're the wall." He let that settle. "Hold the line, and we win." That simple, that hard. The sky to the east was going pale at its edge. The campfires in the hills were still burning. The stamp mill ran on, steady and unhurried, measuring out the last dark minutes in iron and water and the weight of what had been built.